Let's get straight back into it. I'm joined now by former Australian Ambassador to Washington, Joe Hockey, now founder and global chair of Bondi Partners. Great to have you with me tonight, Mr. Hockey. Look, I want to start with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Of course, everyone will remember that you're the former Federal Treasurer of Australia. You're well across these issues. How nervous is Wall Street about a banking crisis?
Well, I don't think it's as nervous as some would think because, Sharri, this was an unusual bank. It took deposits from a lot of Silicon Valley companies, and rather than lending the money out, it went and invested that money in mortgage-backed securities and some other securities, creating a mismatch between the money they were holding and paying interest on and the money that they were investing. And as soon as interest rates rose, that mismatch came into play and the bank collapsed.
There are concerns, though,
Poor governance.
Yes, poor governance, but there are concerns that high interest rates, of course, contributed to this because as the interest rates rose, the bonds' value fell, if you like, and they were forced to sell those US Treasury bonds at a much lower rate than they bought them. Do you think there are concerns that we might see similar issues in Australia, not with banks, which are highly regulated, but with other managed funds where there is less oversight?
Well, there is some risk, but APRA is doing a good job supervising a lot of the funds in Australia. And there's been a lot of consolidation of funds over the last few years. So I don't see a great risk here in Australia at all. Again, this was just poor governance in a bank that took deposits, didn't lend money, and instead of lending money and taking mortgages over people's homes and so on, it went and invested the money in bad investments that gave them no room to move when interest rates inevitably were going to rise.
Yeah, and long-term deposits, and they underestimated how quickly the founders would want access to their own money to grow their business, to grow their startups. Yeah.
To meet payroll.
Yeah, well,
to meet payroll, that's what startups do. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, the other big story of today, AUKUS, we've seen that China, on the eve of this announcement, Xi Jinping declared he'd build a Great Wall of Steel to protect China. We saw Rishi Sunak referring to China as shaping a world now defined by danger. Do you agree with this? Do you think China is challenging our regional order now?
Well, of course it is, and very deliberately. When we were in government in 2013, we were negotiating a free trade agreement with China. The concept of a nuclear-propelled submarine was inconceivable in two areas. Firstly, the Americans would never have sold it to us. And the second was that the Australian people would never have bought the concept and the need for a nuclear-propelled submarine. What's changed is the behaviour of China over the last few years. Far more aggressive, using wolf diplomacy, trying to bully Australia and behaving in intimidating fashion in the South China Sea and against Taiwan. And so they've made this event work for us. We now have the capacity to give anyone that threatens the interests of Australia or Australians a bloody nose if they want to try and hurt us.
But do we actually have that capacity to give anyone a bloody nose? I mean, we're not getting these submarines for another 10, 20, 30 years, depending on delays. What can we actually do?
Well, for a start, the F-35 fighters, which we have, are an offensive capability that allows us to utilise the very best technology in the Air Force, of any Air Force around the world, to deploy to protect our interests. Nuclear-propelled submarines, like the Virginia-class submarine, which we could have within 4 or 5 years, plus the fact that the Americans have announced they're going to increase patrols and base those Virginia-class and the British nuclear-propelled submarines out of Perth in a very short period of time. This all adds to the capacity and sends a very clear message that Australia is not to be messed with. It's coming soon. Just the fact that we're getting them is going to cause China to reassess its own structural defence.
One of your successes in the role of Ambassador, Joe Hockey, is that you could work with both sides of politics. So you continue to do that with the firm you've now founded, Bondi Partners. And you worked closely with former President Donald Trump when you were ambassador. You socialised, played golf with him, made sure Australia had as best a relationship as we could with him, even though there were disagreements. There's every chance the Republicans could get back into the White House. We could even see Donald Trump back into the White House. How do you think Kevin Rudd would go?
Well, look, I've had a few conversations with Kevin Rudd already. I think he's taking an interesting approach to the job and a unique approach. He will get very good access in the United States because he's a former Prime Minister. He'll get even better access because he's a former Australian Prime Minister. And I think he is, has a lot of diplomatic qualities. I think and I hope, and I really will support him. I hope he does a good job, and I expect he will.
If Trump did return to president, do you have any lingering doubts at all that he might not have a full commitment to the AUKUS agreement and the submarine deal that has been struck today?
No. Donald Trump is very aware that Australia is the only country in the world that has stood side by side with the United States in every single major conflict for more than 100 years. We've been there in every major conflict by their side. He sees us as a great friend, perhaps even the closest friend of the United States. He also knows that we pay our way. Unlike some NATO nations, we actually pay for the services that we get and the defence equipment that we get from the United States, and we invest in that relationship. It's a two-way relationship. Donald Trump understands that, and I see no reason for him not to engage as warmly with Australia in the future as he has in the past.
Do you think this AUKUS deal signifies a shift in the US's focus towards our region? Do you think it should have happened sooner?
Look, Sharri, there has been a dramatic change in attitude in the United States with the more aggressive approach of China. It's a response to what's happened. 10, 15 years ago, the United States saw the Middle East and Afghanistan as probably the most significant threats, closely followed by Russia. Today, unquestionably, Indo-Pacific is the biggest challenge for the United States, followed by Russia and followed by the Middle East. And the fact that China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran recently rather than the US says everything about the fact that the US's priorities have changed.
Absolutely. Look, I spoke about that on my show last night. I'd love to talk to you about it more, but we're out of time. Joe Hockey, great to speak to you this evening.